So we're gonna go into our 7 p.m. workshop, and then at 7:30 we'll start our regular meeting. For our workshop, Mr. Clark, our city planner, will run through with us a local law that the council has asked us to review, and then we'll take any remaining time to talk about parking standards and potential revision to the standards, right?
Yes.
So, take it away, John.
All right. I've actually been asked to look at 4 or 5 different zoning changes for the code. So all of them have been briefly discussed. Fishkill Avenue, which I think I talked about last month, has been a topic of discussion at several workshops. And I think the last workshop, it was proposed to scale it back and simplify it a little bit, focus on architectural and landscaping standards and not change the district lines quite as much. So we took out all and this is still in flux, all the currently residentially zoned parcels that would have been in that, and strictly the GB and LI parcels would be potentially converted to Fishkill Avenue with these upgraded landscaping design architectural standards. But the topic for tonight, the one that is actually going to public hearing soon, is sort of miscellaneous corrections. When we redid the zoning code in 2020, sort of did a major rewrite of it, all the tables were changed, and remember that. We got most of it right, but there were at least 2 errors that I found that I'm responsible for. And then E-code in the translation missed about 4 or 5 or 6 other cross-references and minor things. Yeah, so I've been going through and accumulating these and said that someday we should do a correction. So that's what this is. So there's a couple things on the tables that little footnotes, things were wrong. Last half of a sentence when a footnote was left out, things like that in the E-code version. So that was lumped because we were doing changes to the tables in the Fishkill Avenue district. I did them under that, combined them there. So these are textual ones. I think the biggest one, the strangest one, I think, is to eliminate the parking overlay district because nobody can figure out why it's there. It's been there ever since I've been there. It's been ever since John here has been there. And there's no cross-references in the code. It's never been used, as far as I know, for any purpose. And I couldn't find anybody, including the mayor, who knew why it was there. It was instituted in 1992. And somewhere along the line it had meaning, but it doesn't have meaning anymore, so we're just taking it off the zoning map.
If you don't know, Lee doesn't know, nobody knows.
Well, you should know too, you go back quite a ways.
Not to, burn. Not to 1992.
Right.
Can I give a guess?
Cool question.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I give a guess? I think that there was, the former master plan from many years ago envisioned the parking lots, some of which got built, right? And these districts are in the block behind Main Street. I think the intent was probably if dilapidated houses were abandoned, there wouldn't be a renovation of them, they would go to parking,
Mike.
right?
Yeah.
That it would allow easier getting acquiring parcels easier.
Yes.
Parking.
Well, if that's plausible, but it's outdated. We're no longer looking for new parking lots. So, at any rate, that's being eliminated and taken off the zoning map. And none of the other ones are substantial, except that there's one change that I added. Most of them are just consistency, footnotes that are wrong or citations the district no longer exists. One change I did, and this was as a result of Citizens Bank project. Remember that he wanted to extend the building, the 3-story building, over to close to where the mosque was, and wanted to do a 1-story addition there.
Yeah.
because he didn't want to have, block off the air light to the mosque parcel. And when we did the zoning, we forgot to point out that, we wanted to keep two-story minimum along the facades, but not necessarily on the entire building. So this would have prohibited, an accessory maintenance building in the back that was one story, or a rear addition that was one story, like a kitchen off of a restaurant or whatever. So this corrects that. It says one-story accessory buildings to the rear of the principal building are permitted, and one-story sections set back at least 50 feet from the principal building facade are permitted. So that would take care of the, the Citizens Bank.
Curious on that one. At least the way it reads, one-story accessory buildings to the rear, that means it could be a separate
Yes.
entity. Then one-story secondary sections set back at least 50 feet. Does that also mean that those sections should be separate, could be separate, or that?
No, I'm envisioning that as being attached to the building, but
Yeah.
lower in height,
Yeah,
beyond 50 feet from the front plane of the building.
it's just to make it abundantly clear, is there a way to maybe alter the language?
Yeah.
Maybe
John
the word
here had
section?
the same issue. But I couldn't, that was as clear as I could figure out how to make it, and I'll take another attempt if anybody has any wording suggestions.
Well, I figured the architect would, but
Well, I was going to say some attached actually works,
Yeah,
I was going to say something a little bit more lengthy. Portions, contiguous, something to that effect. I think attached sections or something, yeah.
layman's
Attached
terms-
sections, okay.
layman's terms.
Yeah, I'll keep it simple. Right. Was annex?
No, not annexed.
some of the design illustrations were also left out in the E-code version,
For the
so we're putting them back in.
dimensional regs?
What's that?
Sorry, I missed what you, there's some distraction over here.
Yeah. So there were some design illustrations that were originally part of the CMS district that were left out for some reason in the E-code version, so we're putting them back in. We decided it was better to just make a amendment to the code rather than trying to go back with history and say, well, you forgot, you misinterpreted this, or you forgot to put this in, or whatever.
Yep.
Because some of them, a couple of them were my fault, and a couple more of them, they were E-code's fault.
That's big of you to accept blame.
Well, if you remember, there was a lot of changes, a lot of versions of that code, so it was hard to keep everything straight.
Yeah. You sure you caught them all?
Probably, yes. If I didn't catch them, nobody else has.
Yeah. Besides the slight modification to the 1, 2, 3, 4th one. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? I think then what we'll do is send our, I don't know what you call it, approval, acceptance, understanding?
Yeah,
Recommendation.
recommendation to the council.
Yeah, that these are,
I just noticed one thing I had a question about, and it wasn't clear to me. The protective creekside buffer, is that a reference? It just references correctly?
Yeah,
It's not a change or anything?
no, it's not a change, it's just references the wrong paragraph.
okay.
So the other thing, since we have some time, that I thought I'd bring up, so the other three amendments, there's the Fishkill Avenue, which is a sort of a work in progress, been through at least 5 workshops, and I'm not sure we're going to a public hearing soon, but maybe. And then they asked me to look at sections of the code that have minimum sizes for apartments. They want to encourage smaller apartments, so you have less expensive apartments. And were there any, the question was, were there any sections of the code that have minimum size requirements that could be eliminated? And I found 2 or 3. One which I suggested we keep, which is the minimum size for apartments that are in the inclusionary housing section, because they're mixed in with market rate. And I thought that they're already relatively small, as a minimum, and I didn't want to, have shoebox below market rate units and then large luxurious other market rate in the same building. I thought that was unfair. So we kept those, at least at this point in the draft. And then the only other two sections of the code that would be revised to eliminate them are the artist live workspace has some limitations on the size of a artist live workspace. And we said, if you're a jewelry maker or some other artist who doesn't need a lot of space for your workshop or whatever, why not? Why require a minimum? So that somebody could do smaller spaces if they wanted to.
So it's just removing a minimum altogether?
Yes. I make some other changes. There's 3 or 4 or 5 references, the different size requirements. The size of a kitchen was in there, the size of a,
I know it's not practical, but what if some knucklehead came with a 200 square foot apartment?
I think there are
There's state-
requirements within the New York
You hear from
State
Bruce.
Code.
Yeah, there's got to be.
I actually asked,
I'm positive that-
I asked Bruce about that, and he gave me the requirements in the code, and there are minimums, but they're pretty small.
Yeah, the state building code has required minimum sizes for,
So we'll track to
for
that.
different things, but, I think what John was looking to get was the efficiency apartments, trying to, what's the smallest case that could actually take place? And off the top of my head, I think it was 220 square feet, but
Oh,
yeah,
But should
but
we-
that doesn't include, if it doesn't include, a closet for storage, it doesn't include the bathroom, that type of.
So
thing.
250.
So now the-
250.
So now the apartment's gonna start to grow to make it a little bigger at that point.
Yeah, there's required
Just for
elements.
just for the, like the common area space, where somebody's gonna use as their living room, bedroom, that has to be that minimum size, and then, you start adding out for a kitchen area and
I got you.
bathroom as well, and then a closet for storage.
So you're comfortable that it's the IBC?
Yes.
IBC, that covers it? Yeah.
And, just because there isn't a minimum in the code doesn't mean the planning board doesn't have some discretion here, that if somebody came with an 80 square foot apartment or something outrageous,
Well,
the planning board could say no.
They'd hear from Bruce first.
But do we want to say in the code, the minimum is to meet the IBC?
I don't think we have
Yeah,
to.
any self-respecting person should
Somebody's going to come in
reference
with
the
a 100, a
IBC.
10 by 10 room and
Yeah, the code
there's
is,
no minimum.
the code is complicated. It's a couple paragraphs long of different things. So I would just eliminate the minimums, just like we're proposing the minimum parking standards to think about, the minimum, eliminating minimums and allowing the planning board discretion in terms of the size of necessary parking based on the context of the parcels. That's the second one. First one was artist live workspace. The second was there's a senior affordable housing overlay zone, which has only been used once because it was tailor-made for the old hospital. And so no other parcel would qualify for it in the city, even though it's called an overlay zone. So it's a floating zone that has one parcel that can qualify. So that didn't make any sense to me, so I suggested that we overhaul the senior affordable housing overlay to allow lots of parcels to qualify. So, somebody who had a larger parcel wanted to put in some senior housing could come to the city council and make a proposal, and if the council thought that it was worthy and it didn't have major conflicts in the neighborhood or whatever, they could change the zoning, put an overlay district there and allow senior housing to be built. That had a lot of questions from the council, but it did have these minimum housing standards. And for seniors in particular, you can get by with really small stuff because a lot of times they have, common kitchens, cafeteria type things. You can essentially have assisted living and, where you really only need the size of a bedroom and a bathroom. So we took those out, and I made other changes, suggested changes in the draft that would allow the senior housing, affordable housing overlay zone to be used on multiple parcels if you qualified, and
Is it-
you
is
could
it-
convince the council that it's a worthy project.
Yeah, is it applicable to any parcel?
Well, no, there's
with this
still some
level?
minimums,
Well, yeah, okay.
yeah, but it's much more flexible. The building doesn't have to be existing and over 50 years old, which is what the other
Yeah,
one
that's pretty
said.
specific.
And the density was 4 units per acre, which is like a suburban standard because the old hospital had this huge parcel. So, at any rate,
So-
I
so
took
it's-
out a lot of the sort of restricting things so that it would be, the council, we had some, at the workshop where it was going to be discussed, we had some computer issues with the Zoom network, the audio wasn't working really well. So we ended up not discussing it, so I haven't had any feedback from the council, but I thought you should be aware that we're at least talking about these things.
Yeah, nothing we need to share back to the
No,
council?
there's no, they haven't even, they've seen the draft, but they haven't had a chance to even
Okay.
comment on it.
Do you think
And then
there's
the
any-
last,
I was going to say real quick on this topic, do you think there's any appetite for increasing the minimum percentage of affordable units to more than 10%?
there is some interest on the council in that. I've recommended against it because I think the net benefit will be lost, and you'll actually have fewer below-market rate units happen at 20% or 15% than you will at 10%, because it'll just drive people away from the market.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
We've already seen, I've done an analysis of the number of housing units were proposed in the 5 years before the affordable housing section, the inclusionary zoning was included, compared to the 5 years after. And it's like down 50%. Now, that could be attributed to other things. Maybe the market's saturated, maybe Edgewater tilted, but there has been a real shift, and commercial development has gone up by like 80-some%. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was dramatic, that the number of housing has increased since that was adopted, and the number of commercial components has increased by dramatic. And so it's already affecting the market. People are coming in with fewer.
Or it may be. It might be affected. I mean, you don't know
Yeah.
if there's causation, there's a
Exactly.
correlation, but
But there's other cities where documentation has
That's what I
been
was gonna
made.
ask.
Portland, Maine increased it from 10% to 25% or something like that, and like 90% of the housing units, it went down by 90% the next year.
Wow.
So you end up with, this looks good on paper, but it creates fewer units in the long run.
That makes sense.
So,
My own observation, when I've seen like the actual rental rates on the designated affordable units in the newer developments, they're definitely lower than the market rates on the other units, but to be frank, I really wouldn't call them affordable. I mean,
well, they're designated as workforce housing,
yeah,
which is usually a higher percentage than affordable. They were designed for city workers and employed people who don't have higher paying jobs. That was the intent. But it is 70% of median income is the qualifying number. So that's still relatively low, but because the rents are so high, generally speaking, in Dutchess County, it's still not cheap. Not by
70% of-
Beacon, 1980 standards.
well,
70% of just,
2010
country
standards.
median
No,
income
Dutchess
state
County
or
median
county?
average,
Okay,
annual
just county
median.
income.
Yeah. And Dutchess County has a relatively high median income.
What is it, in the 40s?
I have a question. Are there tax incentives for building affordable housing?
Well, through the state, yes,
Okay, so
not through the,
they're getting market rate in the end? Is that how it works?
well, they get market rate because they can make, somebody who has a plot of land can make the most money on market rate housing. So we're requiring 10% to be below market rate, and they have to subsidize that out of their other units.
I'm just trying to understand what's the incentive to make affordable housing?
Well, in this case, it's mandatory. If you're building over 10 units by code, you have to produce 10% of workforce housing.
All
The
right, so
incentive
there's
is
no incentive
penalties.
tax-wise?
Well, there are tax subsidies and tax incentives, but they're through the state, not through the
Yeah,
city, generally speaking.
a provision of New York State law, the private housing finance law, which is provides a very elaborate, basically tax credit system, but that's for either conversion or brand-new construction, and that's typically 100% affordable. Tompkins Terrace recently is transitioning to, PHFL financing. So it's there, but you have to have really a market, someone in the market that this is what they do. They literally build affordable or a large portfolio of their construction management operation is affordable, and the benefits of that is a tax credit system.
So West End Lofts, the front
West
two
End,
buildings
yeah.
were that, they're
Yeah.
100% affordable, and then the back building is market
Right.
rate, which helped pay for the mix. And they got dramatic state subsidies to make that happen.
Right.
So either you get subsidized by the state, or you can get 10% developer financing.
Right. Well, and the other benefit of a private housing finance law transaction is there's an underlying real property tax exemption, but it's usually coupled with a pilot agreement. But that provides a real property tax break to the owner as well. But again, these are entities that,
That's
there
why-
are some local, Ken Carney comes to mind. There are local participants that really focus on that market segment, and there's some national ones as well, but, your typical builder who's coming to Beacon is not going to look for that kind of an avenue.
The other thing I wanted to mention was the council has asked me to prepare a draft that would eliminate minimum parking standards. So I've done that. Again, because of the audio issue at the last workshop, we couldn't actually discuss it. But it is on the table. You could probably read a draft at the last council meeting, council workshop. I don't know.
So that the net effect of eliminating it is basically just crossing it out.
No, that's something else.
This is something
That's
else.
the parking overlay
Parking
district.
overlay, okay.
This is the section 22326, our off-street parking section. I've gone through it and sort of taken out all the requirements for minimum parking, which is sort of the purpose of it up until this point. So we have a list of minimum parking standards for every type of use, and we have exemptions from minimum parking requirements and shared parking and land banking, all these other sorts of things. We have the 1964 exemptions from minimum parking standards.
This makes John happy.
Yes. So what I've done is I've gone through and eliminated all the requirements. So the word required is taken out about 100 times. I took out the 1964 parking exemptions. It seems like we've finally gotten to the point where we should retire that one. 64 is the long time to look back. And the table has gone from a minimum to a maximum table. So it gives guidance to the planning board that this is too much. What used to be a minimum is a maximum now. Now, it does allow you, it's only a recommendation, it's a standard. You can go beyond if the parking study shows that you need more parking, but it's a guidance for you and the developers that we're trying to cut back on excessive parking. And the key paragraph in here is this one, which says, in order to promote walkability and other transportation alternatives, and to avoid excessive automobile traffic and unnecessarily large paved parking lots, no minimum parking number of off-street parking spaces are required, except for a minimum of one off-street parking space for each one or two family dwelling, because they don't come to you. So they would have a minimum of one.
Yep.
And everything else would be determined during site plan. So that said, the planning board shall determine the appropriate number of on-site parking spaces as part of site plan approval, and based on the context of the property, including but not limited to the size of the parcel, the proposed use, existing buildings on the parcel, especially if they are designated as historic, availability of public and street parking in the area, walkable access to public transit, a professional parking study with demand reduction strategies prepared by the applicant, and input from any public hearing. So the following table indicates the maximum parking that should be allowed, but the planning board may require substantially fewer spaces.
So just sort of thinking through a scenario or two.
Yes.
An applicant comes to us and says, based on this, I don't think I require any parking.
Right.
Or it comes to us and says, how much parking do you think we need, planning board?
152, 158 Fishkill Avenue. We were going round and round with them on the parking. So this
Yep.
is,
So this is the same thing would work, except that you wouldn't have a minimum to try to work with.
Yeah,
You would have a maximum you would work with. So they would come in and they would do a parking study on a project that requires site plan. In it, it's required to have demand reduction strategies. So how do you deal with walkability issues, transit issues, bicycle racks instead of parking spaces, those sorts of demand reduction types of issues. It still, in the code, allows you to land bank,
yep.
so that if you think that it's questionable how much you need, you can always require them to land bank spaces.
So there-
Up to
so there is-
50% of the spaces can be land banked.
So there is a mechanism, though, then, for the applicant to be required to come to us with some analysis and to say to us, listen, based on X, Y, and Z of the code
Right,
and other aspects of our application, it's our determination that X number of spaces are adequate.
yeah.
So there's a starting point, instead of them just coming to us and saying,
Oh, yes.
how many planning?
Any large project would be expected to do a parking analysis and come to you with an analysis of how much they think they need based on parking availability and whatever the numbers show. But the way it works now is the planning board is always going through contortions to try to come up with something that satisfies the code number. So they're looking for the exemption or the waiver requirements, or sending the applicant to the zoning board to get a variance. This would eliminate a lot of that stuff, and the planning board would work it out with the applicant, what they think is appropriate.
I know we can't have our cake and eat it too, but, and I obviously see the consideration where on a recurring basis, the boards should, okay, well, this is the parking that's required and whatever, we're gonna approve something else. I am a little concerned that either if we're not starting out with a hard and fast requirement, or if, okay, so you gotta come in with some study. I mean, I've been hiring expert witnesses for the past 20 years, and if you pay people $400 or $500 an hour, they normally say what you want them to.
Under oath?
he pleads the fifth.
Usually they ask for a little more per hour if you're making them testify under oath. Well, I think the concern is pretty much stated just by that. I am a little concerned this is just gonna become a game of who has the nicest PowerPoint presentation.
But you always have your independent the transportation consultant who can give you a hard and fast analysis. It's not, there'll be mechanisms and precedents based on other parcels. And you can make exceptions that way for, say, a historic building that you don't want to put a parking lot next to and it's near a public parking lot. You don't have to go through a variance process or there's multiple cities, over 200 in the country, that have eliminated minimum parking standards, and they're doing relatively well through this system. The latest one was Kingston, New York eliminated all minimums and instituted maximums instead. And they require a demand reduction strategy from each applicant, and,
Similar to what we're proposing here.
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, can I have a question? I happened to look at the Cold Spring Code, and they have a very simple set of parking regulations. There's a parking minimum, and there's a parking maximum, right, for the various uses. And then there's what they call like an efficiency, a shared use efficiency matrix, that whether you're commercial and residential, there's a different multiplier that's used. It's incredibly simple. You don't have to hire a consultant, and it's very clear and predictable for an applicant what the requirements are. And you don't have the problem of consultants, better consultants, a battle of.
Yeah, but numbers game always puts you in a box that it takes away the planning board's flexibility for a project that really you don't think needs any parking. because it's in a range. We have that in the Village of Rhinebeck, too. There's a minimum and maximum range, and it always puts you in a bind if you really don't think it needs the minimum, but you're stuck with it unless they go get a variance.
But don't the efficiency ratios that are standardized, there's recommendations from traffic
It
studies.
standardizes the problem. The people make up these numbers with very little information. If you go to the ITE standards on parking, they're incredibly ridiculous in their parkings. They base the national standards that almost everybody goes by on 4 or 5 studies done in suburban locations, not in urban locations. And they way overestimate the number of parking spaces that are necessary.
But that's
And
what
that's
the-
what all the engineers use.
Don't the consultants use that too?
Yeah.
Similar studies? They're based upon actual case studies.
But they're not case studies in the city of Beacon.
No, but yes, and I agree with the intent. I feel a little uncomfortable. I think a lot of people would, from their own experience, don't feel like they have parking available whenever they want, right? That's not the perception that most people would tell you if you talk to people in Beacon that are driving in and doing things here. And so I would feel more comfortable if we didn't just do this, if there was a study or some sort of analysis of parking demand and parking supply, and also how how this would work out under the current code and under the proposed code in selected example parcels, commercial, residential, right? So that we could understand a little better what that impact is and how it affects the city. Because there's a number of different contexts and locations. There's different, like, Fishkill Avenue is different than downtown, is different than...
That's why it's hard to
Right.
put a one number on each retail use, because Fishkill Avenue will be different. There's no on-street parking out there. There's plenty of on-street parking in the city center. So it's really hard to do these sorts of,
Yeah, the problem is a hard and fast approach, even though it has the advantage of ease of application, is actually kind of an ad hoc thing, but a non-hard and fast approach is always an ad hoc thing.
Nah, that's what I'm trying to get to. And to some degree, it's prescriptive by zone, and by design, with discretion by the planning board, which,
Right.
better than what we have now. I'm just curious, and we're moving past time.
Yeah.
but how is the city council trending on this?
well, I don't know.
Oh, yeah, that's right, you didn't get a chance.
And we've
to
had
give
some,
feedback. Okay.
they haven't seen the draft code yet, or they haven't been able to comment on their draft code yet. They did have a couple of discussions, and there was at least 2 or 3 or 4 who were in favor of eliminating the minimums.
Yeah.
But putting in place some sort of standards or guidance for the planning board, which is what I did through the maximum.
So safe
So
to
they-
say it's a little early for them to hear from us?
Yes.
This may come back, because.
I was just giving you a heads up to start thinking about that.
And so it may be valid to.
And
when
I'm
the
sure
time
there's
comes to share
plenty of people
concerns back.
who think that there's not enough parking, and we should raise the parking standards rather than eliminate them.
I ordered a book, so I'm going to try and educate myself. Because like I said, I'm skeptical. It doesn't seem, it breaks from standard practice, and I'd love to see what other similar towns have.
Yeah.
that
There's the book by
experience.
Donald Shoup.
Yeah, I was going to say, is it the high cost of free parking?
No. I used to listen to a podcast from that guy. And there's another
So
more-
we got
I know it's 7:35, just one really quick thing, on the parking thing. One idea I heard about from a friend of mine who works in the planning department in a different locale in New York is the possibility of going the exact opposite way of what you're talking about, frankly, in lieu of parking fees, meaning you have a parking requirement
Yeah.
and you are either providing the parking or you're paying per parking spot fees. It goes into a pot run by the city provides parking.
We used to do that as well.
That would have.
There's
the
still a
advantage of
provision in the
application.
code about it, but
It
it,
should be the
generally
simplest way to
speaking,
get the
doesn't
traffic
ever
on it.
produce enough parking that, and it just drives up the cost of housing, because they have to pay $10,000 a space,
Right, the
and the
cost of
city
carrying
never
on,
gets enough
passed
money
on.
to actually create a space of parking. So those things generally, unless you really soak them, like $20,000, $30,000 of space, you never can create enough parking, or you can't create parking using the amount of money that you get, generally speaking.
And in and of itself, somewhat of a disincentive to development, if you're trying to soak.
Yes, and if parking is, by studies, 17% the cost of housing is in the parking. So if you can eliminate parking, you bring down the cost of housing. If you charge them $10,000 a space or whatever the in lieu fee is, you're losing that advantage.
Yeah, look, if you've got a parking requirement, either the developer is going to devote more space to parking and less space to the building, meaning whoever you want to say is subsidizing it, everyone's subsidizing it, one
Yes.
person is, whatever. Or on the in lieu of fee thing, they're either going to provide the parking or they're going to pay the fee, or under the ad hoc thing, they're going to pay the consultants to try to get them the best result they can. But no matter how you cut it, if there is a parking requirement, this is a cost of doing the project, and it would be accurate, if you want to put it that way, to say this is driving up the cost of housing, but having to comply with the fire code is driving up the cost of housing.
Yep,
Okay, I think we'll leave it there.
okay.
Safe to say, more to come.